Shall I stop sharing?
You can stop sharing for a few seconds and then we can do the slides as you begin speaking, I think.
Good.
Terrific. All right, so people are probably joining us for tonight's webinar. So I want to take a few moments to welcome each and everyone for joining us. This is the second session of our webinar series on multidimensional well-being. My name is Sebastian, and I will be moderating today's webinar together with my colleague, Raphael. This webinar series serves the purpose of bringing together established scholars, junior researchers, and practitioners working to conceptualize, measure, and improve multidimensional well-being. Through this webinar series, we aim to address and allow for discussions regarding long-standing and contemporary issues surrounding the conceptualization and measurement of well-being, with a special focus on applications related to the capability approach. General themes running through the series include concepts of well-being, which we will be talking about today, but also philosophies of well-being measurement, methodological issues, including formal procedures, but also the role of participation and deliberation, empirical applications and challenges, policy uses and implications, as well as current research frontiers. This series is hosted by a group of junior scholars in the Human Development and Capability Association. As mentioned, I will be moderating today's session together with my colleague Raphael, but I wish to note that we are only two out of several colleagues who have been working behind the scenes to design this series. I want to extend my thanks to all of them for their excellent contributions so far. More information about this webinar series can be found on our website, 2021webinarseries.com, which will soon be linked in the chat. If you would like more information about upcoming webinars, please feel free to enter your email address in the forum that we will also shortly link in the chat. The webinar is now going live, and my colleague Raphael will introduce today's speaker. First of all, welcome, Raphael. Please feel free to take it from here.
Thank you, Sebastian. And thank you, Ingrid Robeyns, for joining us in our second session. We are very appreciative, of course, for your support for us junior scholars, the HDC scholars, in getting this webinar series going. And by way of introduction, Ingrid Robeyns is a professor of Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and she chairs the Ethics of Institutions at the Ethics Institute. And more recently, she has attained the ERC Consolidated Grant for a project on the fair limits. And this explores how morally permissible it is to have too much personal wealth or to possess too much valuable goods, and the extent of developing an upper limit to such wealth. She has written extensively on the capabilities approach, as some of you might be aware, especially as it pertains to gender studies and to social justice. And she has more broadly also covered topics on policy, ethics of autism, and basic income, amongst others. So beyond just scholarly writings, she has also served as the preceding president, the 8th president between 2018 to 2020 at the Human Development Capabilities and Capabilities Association. And her most recent book on the capabilities approach is titled Wellbeing, Freedom, and Social Justice, the Capabilities Approach Re-Examined. I believe we'll be touching upon this work along with a more recent article titled Wellbeing, Place, and Technology, 2020, today. And her book is free to download, and we will provide a link here for you to acquire a copy if you do not already have it. So I'm very privileged to introduce Ingrid Robeyns for this session. But before we pass the baton to her, I would just like to quickly mention how we go about this webinar. So we designed this webinar, we designed this series actually to try and facilitate discussion across And in spite of the size of the format constraints, we are trying to leverage some of the communication channels that we have enabled here for discussion. So we have two channels, the chat function, which we encourage your comments, as well as the Q&A function, which we encourage your questions. So if you were to type these in, Sebastian and I, along with our other organizing team members, will sort them out and then try and deliver them to Robeyns. And just to note, this is a 1.5 hour session, and the session will be recorded. But the recording will only show the presentation slides and the speakers and panelists. So you do not have to worry if your camera is on or if your sound is enabled, which I believe it's not. And one last note, as you develop questions, please send it to us, even though the presentation is ongoing, so that we would close the gap between the presentation and the questions that will roll in after that. So we will also have more time to process your questions and to bring this then to Robeyns to address. So without further ado, I present to you Ingrid Robeyns.
Thank you, Sebastian and Raphael, for this nice introduction, and thank you for the entire team for organizing this and putting this together. I think it's really one of the very few, but an important advantage of that we all learned how to use Zoom and Teams and all the other media over the last year, that we can actually have a discussion. Well, a discussion is perhaps a bit of a big word, but we can at least have some sort of exchange tonight on the topic of well-being and the capability approach, and you have a whole series, so that's really fantastic. And thank you all from all over the world for joining in. I see in the chat people saying where they come from, and it's actually quite fun to see, but I will have to no longer look at this because I will start talking about the presentation that I made. So I will share my screen now, and so that you can see the PowerPoint. Okay, here it goes. The presentation I want to give is about how one can use the capability approach to conceptualize well-being, and I will share my thoughts about this and what I see as possibilities, how there are multiple ways in which one could do this, but also possible advantages and disadvantages. And specifically, I want to do the following things. I will very briefly say something about the capability approach, because I'm assuming that most people attending this seminar know the capability approach well. And I will then also relatively briefly present to you the modular account of the capability approach that I've developed in my book. I think it's important to present this, even though I have to keep it brief, because it explains how I see the different possibilities to engage with well-being in the capability approach. Because one important thing that I want to argue for is that there is not just one account of well-being in the capability approach, but that one can use the capability approach in multiple and flexible ways to use it for the analysis and first-hand the conceptualization of well-being, depending on the purpose for which one wants to, one needs it. And I say purpose, and that concretely I will point out two factors: contextualism and interdisciplinarity. And this is also why I'm really glad that I am in the second in line after Anna Alexandrova, because I think she's done some great work on contextualism and well-being that I think is highly relevant for people working with the capability approach. I will say something about that too. I will then move on to describe the ways in which we can use the capability, well-being in the capability approach, discuss some advantages and disadvantages, and then I will just close with some closing points, some thoughts I have working on this topic for a number of years, and then I hope we will despite the fact that we are all talking to or looking at a screen, have a fruitful discussion. So let's first very briefly by way of warming up, tell you what the capability approach is. Before I do that, I want to say that I will be using, this is of course before I go to talk about the capability approach, I want to refer to 3 open access works that I will use for my talk. One is the book, 2017 book. The second one is a reply to several critics of the book that was published in the Journal of Human Development. And the third one is a paper I published last year on in a new journal where I discuss in more detail how Anna Alexandrova's work can be very fruitful for capability scholars wanting to use the capability approach for thinking about well-being. All of these are open access, so you can just click on the links, and then this also serves as a kind of backup in case I'm going too fast or you get lost when I'm giving this presentation. I think most of what I want to say is in different places in those works. Okay, now the content. First, I'll start with a quote by Amartya Sen. He said, what is the capability approach? It's an intellectual discipline that gives a central role to the evaluation of a person's achievement and freedoms in terms of his or her actual ability to do the different things a person has reason to value doing or being. That's a very long definition or a very long description, and often we need to unpack it and tease it apart. But what is central, I think, is that it's a framework, and this really is important. It's not a neatly tied theory, it's a framework. It's about people's well-being, and I take well-being in the capability literature to interchangeable with quality of life. Well-being is central, and that well-being in the capability approach has 2 layers. It has the layer of achieved well-being or achieved quality of life, and freedom to achieve a good quality of life. Freedom understood as opportunity freedom, so thick freedoms, not what philosophers call negative liberties, merely not being hindered to reach a certain outcome, but being put in the actual condition to reach a certain outcome if that is what one decides that upon reflection that one wants to do. The capability approach as a normative framework guides us to focus, or tells us to focus on people's capabilities. That is what people are able to do and to be. And there are many examples. Here are a couple: being able to hold a good job, being able to have a family, being able to enjoy leisure activities, being able to practice your religion, being able to learn valuable things, being free from violence of various sorts, being free from excessive levels of stress and worries. And I think all of us can think of specific cases where people right now, somewhere in the world, do not have those capabilities. Unemployed people do not have the ability to hold a decent job. Children who are separated from their parents at the border of when they try to migrate are no longer able to be with their family. Some people have to hold 2 jobs to avoid poverty, so they do not enjoy leisure activities. People who are the victims of religion bashing, which is unfortunately something that is again very prevalent, do not enjoy the freedom to practice their religion without being discriminated against. And one can go on and on and on. And the reason why this is important to have a few examples is because it shows both the riches of the capability approach. One can look at all these dimensions, and it also shows that we are really in the realm of the full riches of human life. This is not just about, say, poverty understood as insufficient nourishment. It's also about all the things that you see here on the screen. We know that in the capability approach, functionings, which are the achievements, and the capabilities are ends, and they are the things we care about. However, resources do have instrumental functioning, have instrumental value. They are the means that we need to reach those functionings and capabilities. So resources are also important, but instrumentally important. In addition, a couple of other important points of the capability approach is that the environment plays an important role in whether it enables or constrains people's capabilities. But human diversity is a crucial characteristic of the capability approach. People need different kinds and different amounts of those resources in order to have a good quality of life. The typical example from Amartya Sen's work is that somebody who is in a wheelchair, somebody who is unable to walk needs a wheelchair in order to be mobile. But you can find examples for all sorts of forms of human diversity where one can argue that you need certain protections by the law or social norms or customs or provisionings in the built environment, why different people need different resources and different environments. Okay, now that is just kind of what is the capability approach. And what I tried to do in the 2017 book is to look at all the ways in which the capability approach had been used in the literature, and to try to, one could say, find the common structure of this. And the reason is that I deeply believe that the capability approach should not be a theory that we just take and apply, or take and just believe or use, but that it should be something that is sufficiently flexible for us as scholars, as students, as practitioners, as policymakers to use for our purposes. I think the capability approach can do that, but what the modular account tried to do is to help us in seeing what exactly do we need to do before we can use the capability approach for our own purposes. And in order to tease out then what exactly the capability approach would be if you take this more flexible approach, I proposed a modular account that has 3 modules. The first one is what I call the A module. That's a module which is compulsory for all capability theories or capability approaches. So basically what I'm saying there is, if you want to have a capability approach or theory, you should have those elements. The B modules are modules where you have to make a choice, but there are options. And the C modules are contingent. They depend either on whether you've made a particular choice in B, or they can be fully optional. If I will have to go through this rather quick, because otherwise we won't get to the topic of well-being, but I think it may play a role in the discussion and also in how I look at the capability approach as you could say, a tool. And that's why I do want to touch upon it nevertheless. But if if this is the first time you come across this modular account, I would suggest that you look it up in the book and that you can read it at your own pace to see what exactly this modular account entails. So the A module has 8 claims or propositions. And some of these are kind of, you could say, almost open doors. One is, and I will just focus on a few that I think are important. Functions and capabilities are the core concepts. That is essential. I think I'll skip many of them, but I want to focus on, towards the end, there is the question about the dimensions of ultimate value. So there are more dimensions of ultimate value than only functions and capabilities. That is important because whatever you do with the capability approach, in the discussion of tonight, it is about well-being, but you could also use it for something else. I don't think the capability approach would claim that this is the only thing that matters. And capability scholars, those applying the capability approach, should always keep an open mind whether there are other dimensions of ultimate value that may not be best captured in the capability approach. So the example that Amartya Sen gives is process freedoms. They are, you could possibly, perhaps if you really stretch it theoretically very far, you could perhaps squeeze them in as some form of capability, but sometimes there are other theoretical counts that are more suited to think about, in this case, process freedoms. Value pluralism is also very important, and that entails at least two different things. One is principle pluralism. So for example, you could have the principle people's well-being is a crucial value of social policy making, but it doesn't mean that this is the only principle of policy making. You could also have other principles. So that is at the level of all the different principles of goals that one could have, either for, say, ethical analysis or societal critique, or for evaluation, or for policy, or for some other purpose. But value pluralism has a second dimension, and that is that within a concept such as well-being, you have multiple sub-elements. So we had the list of all these different capabilities. Well, they are all elements of a good life. So multidimensionality, I think, is one of the crucial and absolutely undeniable features of the capability approach. The B modules, recall, there are modules where you have to make a choice if you want to use the capability approach, but there are different ways in which you can make the choice. The first one is actually also relevant for the discussion of well-being, because the question is, what is the purpose of the capability theory? Why are you using it? And I think you have to answer that question before you can see what account of well-being exactly you need to develop, what conceptualization of well-being you need. You need to, secondly, select dimensions. So that was one of the forms of pluralism we discussed. And you also need to have certain, what you could see as background notions, a notion of human diversity, a notion of agency, a notion of structural constraints. They will all play a role in the capability application or theory that you will develop. B6 is an interesting one for capability theories to well-being, because I believe that the capability approach can accommodate both a focus on functionings or capabilities, or both. So you can, I think, if you have an account of well-being that focuses on well-being achievements, and hence you look at functionings, that may, for a certain purpose, be the right thing to look at. For another purpose, it may be more appropriate that you look at capabilities. The answer to what is appropriate in which context, we cannot give in general. You really have to always keep thinking yourself and ask yourself, what exactly am I doing here, and what are the reasons why we make certain choices or other choices? And sometimes it may also be the case that you make a combination of functionings and capabilities, and that could be either on principled grounds or on pragmatic grounds, for example, because you do not have certain data available if you do empirical work. The main thing is you have to know what you're doing and always be clear about why you do something. If you can justify the choices you make, you're free to make the choices that you think are best for the purpose for which you're using the capability approach. And then C, sometimes additional ontological and explanatory theories play a role. That is, I think, I don't know whether that's very relevant for well-being. Weighing dimensions can be very relevant if you do overall evaluations or judgments. And then, of course, C3 is very important if you do measurement of well-being. How are you going to collect the data? and how are you going to analyze this? How are you going to, for example, if you want to have an aggregation, how exactly will you do this? This comes back to C2, the weighing of the dimensions. Okay, so this was in a nutshell. Well, in a nutshell, not so nutshell. I have to quickly look. Oh, we're already 5 to 8. Well, in the Netherlands, I don't know where you are. It may be a different time. So I'll move on to the next point. The point I want to make now is that contextualism and interdisciplinarity are crucial to understand the capability approach, and also to understand why we sometimes have sometimes misunderstandings, sometimes disagreements within the capability literature, but also these are things one needs to be aware about when you want to use the capability approach for the understanding of well-being or for other purposes. I'll start with interdisciplinarity first. I should say that of course, we all know the capability approach is an interdisciplinary approach, but the impact of this, I only realized fully when I was writing this book, and especially also when I was engaging with some of the comments that I received, because people who are in a discipline read things differently, and they look for different tools. So the word discipline, actually, it means that you become trained, but also disciplined. So you become, I don't know how else I should explain this than repeating the word. You become also, in a certain sense, narrowed. There's a certain disciplinary straitjacket that you, or habitus, you could say, a socialization as within a discipline that you acquire. And that means that you look for certain things when you see a theory. So that means that those using the capability approach have different expectations, and also have different ways in which they want to use the approach. And now there are two things worth stressing. One is that what one considers as a scholarly virtue differs between disciplines. So, for example, the question of the first seminar also about whether you could do co-creation in knowledge design, or whether you can have participatory research. In some disciplines, this is highly valued. In other disciplines, people they're suspicious. Take the value of parsimony. Mainstream economists think that parsimony is very important in their work. And other disciplines do not think this is important. So in my own field, for example, systematic or analytical philosophy, many people believe that the distinctiveness of a certain approach or theory of concept is very important. Whereas if I collaborate with, say, sociologists, they don't care. They care about what does this mean for the analysis we're making. And this really is, if you work in multidisciplinary teams, then it really, it hits you in the face how difficult interdisciplinarity is. And I think we all, or many people in the capability approach embrace it. We all say, yes, interdisciplinarity is important, but actually it may be much more difficult than we have been realizing. And one of the effects of interdisciplinarity, so the first thing is scholarly virtues, and the second is that we have different uses for the same word. And this leads to confusions and also to disagreements. So the way I understand the Henry Richardson's critique on my book, namely that we should not have used the word well-being, I think is based on different understandings of, or different meanings of the word well-being between different disciplines. So in what I in the reply call classical philosophy, so that's you could say just like we have mainstream philosophy, mainstream economics, we also have something like mainstream analytical philosophy. The idea of well-being there is what is important for the person herself from a first-person perspective. This is crucial, first-person's perspective. So what do I find important when I judge the quality of my own life? And that is something completely different than what, say, a policymaker who wants to roll out something like the well-being economy, which is something that now governments of Scotland, New Zealand, and some other countries are trying to develop, how they understand it. So first-person perspective, third-person perspective, for some, this already makes a very big difference in how you understand well-being. And then you just see that people, that for a certain philosopher, it doesn't make sense to think that that we're talking about well-being, whereas for many others, it is really crucially about well-being. So that's the problem with interdisciplinarity. And then there's contextualism. Here I only touch upon a few elements, but anybody interested in contextualism, I really recommend Anna Alexandrova's book on well-being, which explains this very well. I've tried to briefly summarize how I think her approach to seeing the notion of well-being as that you always have to ask what is the context in which this is used. I've tried to explain how this is that I think this is very useful for the capability approach in the paper I wrote last year. But what are these different contexts? Well, even within academic research, you have different types of research. You have theoretical research, you have conceptual research. Some people want to make thick descriptions. If you do a thick description of a situation, so for example, you do narrative research, you can really bring in all those dimensions because you do not have, for example, constraints about data gathering, etc. But if you want to do measurement, it becomes already much more difficult. The same about micro, meso, macro. That's a different context, and other dimensions too, such as quantitative and qualitative research. And that's all only within the narrow scope of academic research. But outside academia, we have policy advice, we have policy criticism. I mean, journalists are criticizing policies, but citizens are doing that too. We have advocacy, we have guidance that is given by NGOs, etc. The list is long. And also in our daily lives, we make decisions, or we make decisions for, say, our children, or for we advise our friends with ideas of well-being in mind, but in that context, well-being may mean something different than in another context. And that then brings me to the next claim, which is that there are different notions of well-being in the capability approach. First of all, given interdisciplinarity and contextualism, which I just explained. Secondly, because the capability approach itself has a fundamental distinction between, on the one hand, freedom, opportunities, and on the other hand, achievement outcomes. So you have well-being freedom and you have well-being achievement. And for some contexts, it's maybe more relevant to look at the freedom that people have to achieve well-being, and in other contexts, it may be their achieved well-being. And the other notions, the other way in which we can have different notions is that one can make different choices in the modules. So you could, for example, have a notion of well-being that is because you choose as a purpose, you choose that you're going to develop a measurement. Well, you're going to develop an account of well-being that you will then eventually use for measurement. Then this will restrict what you will, for example, put in the dimensions, because it's impossible to have an endless number of dimensions if you want to do measurement. So this, I think, makes clear that there is not one conceptualization of well-being in the capability approach. And then I think the question is now, where is the account? Where then do I find my account of well-being in the capability approach? Well, I am sorry, but I think the answer is you will have to do that work yourself. You have to look at your question, at what you are studying or the issue you're addressing, and ask yourself, what is the account of well-being that I need for this particular purpose? And of course, there's lots of work in the literature that can help you with this, but in the end, you have to make your own choices. In addition, it's also important to keep in mind that well-being is not the only thing that matters. There are often other valuable goals. For example, Martha Nussbaum's work on the capability approach is about fundamental political entitlements. That is not the same as well-being. Although there is overlap, or they are concepts that are related, one could say, they're not exactly the same. But in essence, I think whatever the notion of well-being is that you will carve out of the capability approach, I think there are some essential elements. One is multidimensionality. It will always have to be multidimensional. And the second is that it should focus on the things that matter. And that means that it will almost inevitably bring the material and the non-material together. And that is, I think, a major improvement over at least accounts of well-being, although then one often uses the word welfare, that are often used in policymaking and that only focus on the quality, no, not on the quality of life, but on the standard of living of people. Okay, this brings me to the advantages and the disadvantages of using the capability approach for an account of well-being. I think the first and most important advantage is it enables us to capture what matters. And actually that advantage to me is just almost whatever the disadvantages are. This is so important that that is the reason why I like to work with the capability approach and why I endorse it, because I just think it often shows dimensions of people's quality of life that matter to them and that should matter to us as fellow citizens or fellow human beings, and that are then left out in other analyses. That's the first reason. It enables us to capture what matters. The second advantage of using the capability approach is that it removes biases against certain groups when they are scoring low on well-being dimensions that are not included in restricted well-being indicators. So restricted well-being indicators could be, for example, well-being indicators that were that focus on, say, purchasing power or disposable income as proxies for well-being, or a set of material indicators. They could be biased against, for example, disabled people if they need more of those goods and of other goods and environmental circumstances in order to receive the same quality of life. This was one of the findings that Wiebke Kuklis made in her doctoral research. It could also be because for some groups, for example, whether they are able to give proper care and whether they are supported in the care that they have to give and want to give is part of the well-being analysis, which is crucially important for in order to see gender differences in well-being, which is one of the reasons why the discipline of feminist economics is that many people working in feminist economics endorse the capability approach, because it allows them to bring in that dimension that is crucial. And one can go on and look at other groups too. So this is the second advantage. And the third one is that it enables us to resist what you could see as materialist, or some people use the term economistic accounts of decision making. This is, I guess, for people who want to focus on societal critiques, on different ways of living, on also critiques of capitalism, on post-growth economics, on people who work on ecological questions, I think is very important. So those are, I think, three main advantages. I'm sure there are more, but these were the ones that came to my mind first. Then the disadvantages. Well, first, it is difficult to use. It is difficult to use given multidimensionality. You have to think about all the dimensions. And multidimensionality may also, of course, lead to measurement difficulties, or at least challenges. The second one is there is no blueprint. You need to keep thinking for yourself. Well, I think that's actually exciting. So I should perhaps not have put it under a disadvantage, but I can understand that we are, of course, as scholars and scientists, we like to know for sure that we are doing it properly. And in the capability approach, the way to know that you're doing it properly is by inviting criticism. And then if nobody is able to give you a form of critique that you think makes sense, then you think, yes, I think this makes sense what I've been doing. There is no statistical test, or there is no manual that you can use. The third disadvantage is that there's limited data availability. It is, of course, improving, since some scholars have devoted their careers to gathering new data. Of course, Sabine Alkaier and Ofi are, I think, the prime example. They have collected data for many years, which allow also other scholars to do research on this, on multidimensional poverty analysis. And the fourth disadvantage is that if one does not want to measure achieved well-being, but rather look at opportunities, then there is a challenge that it's actually very difficult to measure opportunity sets. And even opportunities themselves, since they may be dependent on other, sometimes you may have sometimes it may be difficult to find the exact formulation in, say, in a questionnaire, if you can collect new data, to measure exactly the opportunity. And one of the problems is also that if you want to not only measure multidimensional well-being outcomes, but in addition opportunities, the questionnaires may become so long that you do not find enough representative and diverse people to fill out the questionnaires. So there are all sorts of methodological measurement and data gathering problems if you want to go to the level of opportunities. Okay, last slide. Some remarks and thoughts that I would like to share with you. The first one is that throughout my talk, I've mentioned a couple of times that the capability approach is useful because it can provide us an account of well-being that is takes into account human diversity, where people live, what their lives are, their religion, disabilities, and so on. But I want to raise the question whether the capability approach really does have a proper account of human diversity. We all talk about it. We have within the Human Development and Capabilities Association groups of people who gather around clusters. We have people who work on disability. We have some people who've worked on gender, and we can go on. But actually, a fully worked out account of human diversity, I think that would be something that would strengthen the capability approach. So now I've already also told you what I will be working on in the next 6 months. The second point I had as when I was thinking about well-being and the capability approach is that we should not think that everything that's valuable for us as scholars or students or practitioners can be found within the capability approach. Because of its interdisciplinary nature, it's quite likely that for a particular purpose, you can find established discussions or theories in neighboring debates or disciplines that could be useful to merge into what you're doing or to collaborate with in an epistemic way. The third question is about the idea of collective well-being. Well, you know, I will skip this because I'm sure I'm going to get a question on this. And I also would think we should move to Q&A soon. But collective well-being is something on which within those who like to advance the capability approach, we should talk about more. And then I think the last one is the thing I always say, which is let's not become dogmatic. The capability approach is a tool. If it's useful, we use it. If it's not useful, we don't use it. Sometimes another theory may be more helpful for our purposes. So sometimes another conceptualization or another metric might be more relevant for the purpose at hand. So then we should just go to that other theory or that other approach. And that's why we should always keep thinking and just see which is the right theory or framework for the question we're currently addressing. That was it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ingrid Robeyns, for your presentation. So we have a lot of questions. So just to open up, I would like to point towards the direction of this notion of having very different notions of well-being. I mean, you addressed diversity on very different fronts. There's many different notions of well-being and how it's used. There is the first person and third person point of view. And there is also the how it's used in terms of its as achievement as it is in freedom. So from the first comment I'd like to share is that Des Gaspar has also shared on the chat that he has a paper 2010 titled Understanding the Diversity of Conceptions of Well-Being and Quality of Life, published in the Journal of Social Economics, volume 39. And here I would like to point this to a question from, give me a moment, I have to find it, from a Sarah Isabel Espinoza Fleur. And her question is, could a first-person definition of well-being, as understood here by Robeyns, be compatible with the classical Aristotelian conception of eudaimonia, or the good life, which is rather defined by the choice to actually live a virtuous life? Could a virtuous life be an ultimate life goal within module A, as it could lead to a good life, hence to a life of well-being?
Can I answer or?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks. Yes, that's actually excellent that you mentioned a paper by Des. So I hope somebody can put the reference in the chat, because I think that's well, I'm sorry I can't talk to Des now, but I think that's compatible with also what I'm arguing for, that there are different ways. We use the term in different ways. And yeah, you just have to think what is the best account for your purposes. And also, I believe that's a point that Des has also made in his writings, but also somebody like Ian Goff has also made this point, that, for example, accounts of well-being in the capability approach or in the basic needs approach or in other approaches, if you work them out, often they actually overlap to some extent. So there is overlap between what people have been doing in different traditions, and it's good to see what others have been doing. Now to the question of eudaimonia and the first person. The first person account of well-being is not one that I'm in particular using. I'm saying that it is in a way in which classical philosophers have been understanding what well-being entails. So they define well-being as how well a life is going, and then they stress for the person herself. So of course, if and then the accounts that are developed, this is the classical distinction that Parfit made this in his book Reasons and Persons, is between hedonistic accounts and desire fulfillment accounts and objectivist accounts. And many of the philosophers who work from this first person perspective then say objectivist accounts, which could be a daimonistic views, could be one of them. They are they have fewer defenders because the philosophers argue about all these things, but they are the accounts that are have most defenders are accounts that are also much more from the perspective of the person herself, because they are by definition first person accounts. So often the debates end up with being arguing for some form of desire fulfillment accounts where the desires have been sufficiently cleaned of all sorts of biases. Why is that, and how does this differ from daimonistic accounts? Well, if Aristotle says that friendship is important for us to live a good life, or he takes the virtue ethics route and says we have to live virtuous life in order to have good lives, then the first person account, that is a desire fulfillment account, can say, well, I just like to sit at my computer all day, and I would like to watch or I would like to play games, and that's it. That's how I define a good life. As long as I can pay my rent, this is what I'll do. I don't care about living a virtuous life. So this is just why these different perspectives just have totally different accounts of well-being. And the point I wanted to make by referring to these first-person accounts is that this is precisely why I don't think anybody has a monopoly on saying this is what well-being is. Different people in different disciplines and different traditions use the term well-being, and there's not somebody who can say, well, no, this is what well-being is, and you should talk about something else.
As a follow-up to this point about the classical philosophy point of view for first-person perspective, another related question from Jonathan Clausen goes, could this difference between the meaning of well-being in classical philosophy, for which well-being focuses only on what is important from a first-person perspective, and in other disciplines, explain the fact that Sen claims that well-being goals and agency goals are different things? In Appendix A of Creating Capabilities, Nussbaum criticizes Sen for making this distinction. Would you comment on that, please?
Okay. I don't know. I have to think about this. But I don't know whether, so I actually think it does. I don't think it's about, my suspicion is that the explanation why Sen thinks that well-being and capabilities and agency can be are different, and Nussbaum does not think this, has another reason, and that is when Sen is thinking about collective action and especially about commitments that people have, he wants to allow for the possibility that the person is doing something that lowers or diminishes her own well-being, but she does it because she has certain agency goals. So for example, suppose, well, I think we have, in Europe, we have the citizens of Belarus have been going on the streets for more than, I mean, for months now, they risk being brutally beaten. They risk being put in jail. They risk being tortured. So they know they take a serious risk to their well-being. Still, the reason why they do this is because of their agency goals. They want to have, they're fighting for democracy. And I think I think that is an example of why the two things could be separated. Yeah, Nussbaum just has in her list of fundamental entitlements, she has practical reasoning as an overlapping and architectonical capability. And you could say that many of the things that are agency goals for Sen are for her in that account. So I also sometimes think, given that words have different meaning for different people, sometimes I think we should worry less about does this account have space enough or has enough space for, say, well-being or agency or something else, but rather does everything that matters find a place in that theory? And then I think it's less important whether it goes under the name well-being or it goes under agency because well-being, some people just use it much broader and others use it more restricted. And I think depending also on the context, there may be good reasons for this.
Terrific. Thank you so much. On that note, we have a question from Evelyn Kim, who first says, thanks for the interesting presentation, Ingrid. So that's good. The question then goes, how policymakers and sometimes even the public understand the notion of well-being often depend on how well-being is conceptualized and communicated in the global level. How would you evaluate the conceptions of well-being suggested by intergovernmental organizations like the OECD, for instance, the Better Life Index, PISA measurement of student well-being, and the UN, for instance, the World Happiness Report?
Yes. So this is one of the disadvantages of this format, that I can't ask for clarification or details. So I agree with the claim that how intergovernmental organizations conceptualize well-being determines also how people understand well-being. I read the first OECD Better Life Index report, but that is already years ago. So I have to try to remember the dimensions. But I think the crucial bit is really the dimensions. And for example, since the OECD report is about OECD countries and hence by definition materially relatively rich, at least at an aggregate level, one could so I think one of the dimensions in those societies that I believe is not included in that report is what you could call avoidable levels of stress. So many people in advanced capitalist societies are materially well off, but have high levels of stress because they have flex jobs, they have all sorts of worries, or social fabric isn't supporting them enough, and or they just feel a certain pace in life that is too fast for them. And I have actually never seen an intergovernmental well-being conceptualization that includes avoidable levels of stress. So this is one example where I think that if you ask your friend, how are you doing? When you're actually asking, how is your well-being? That's not what we say, but this is, well, at least part of what we ask when we ask each other, how are you doing? They will, I mean, I don't know about your friends, but they will often say, oh, I'm having a fight with, I don't know, my boyfriend or whoever, or my children are being unruly. And so it's often about interpersonal relations and stress that, or you have a conflict with your boss. And that's interesting that those dimensions are often not in that, in those conceptions. And your question also provokes another thought, which is, an Australian colleague told me that in Australia, there was somebody in politics who suggested that Australia would also use the New Zealand example of using well-being as the indicator for government policy. And apparently, I haven't been able to check this because I believe this was on television. Apparently, in Parliament, somebody said, yeah, well-being, we're all gonna have yoga mats and we'll have yoga classes. And so they were making fun of the notion of well-being because they associated it with people taking yoga classes. So this is another example where well-being also sometimes has this association of being soft. And then that may also be a reason why people prefer in certain contexts not to focus on it. So I agree with the question that two things. First, that the way it's being used matters on how we understand the term. And secondly, that it's important to look at the details of what is included in those metrics by, or conceptualizations by, intergovernmental organizations.
Thank you very much. So relatedly, moving to questions of policies, Suming Ku writes, hello, Ingrid. I'm constantly saddened or annoyed that there is not much serious uptake of the capability approach in discourses about policies and quote unquote development, even critical ones. Most critiques or rejections of the human development or capability approach are quite surface. Looking at the disadvantages, difficulty of use, lack of blueprints, data limitations, I wonder if these disadvantages are really quite serious and if they can be overcome. And on that note, I'd also like to add that we had this point echoed in part by Karishma Patel, who wonders whether you have any thoughts on how the capability approach could be or has been successful in sort of mitigating the disadvantages that you brought up.
Yes, so I do think it's important to have blueprints and to have well worked out examples, but we will need many of them. So for example, we have different purposes. That's the first starting point. So in say theories of justice, we have had for a long time Martha Nussbaum's theory, but we also, for example, my colleague Rutger Klaassen has developed a full theory of justice. So you just want different examples of how it can be done. I think you need to make it concrete and well worked out in order to show the value of the approach. But the fact that it's flexible and can be used for different ways comes at the price that there's just not one cookbook. There's just many, or you could say there's not one recipe, there's a cookbook with many recipes. Yeah, with policy, I think, development policy is just such a broad area. It basically touches on everything. So that means also that micro, meso, macro. So I think I would just hope that, for example, all the examples of studies that are published in the Journal of Human Development Capabilities, can eventually be used also to convince skeptics of the value of the approach for certain circumstances. And whether the capability approach doesn't have much uptake, I don't know whether, so I guess it depends on the environment in which we sit, whether that is the impression we get. So I'm, for example, quite excited about this this move of several countries taking up the moving towards the well-being economy. Although these are not developing countries, of course, they're all OECD countries, because that is really a new frontier where you just see them explicitly saying we want to develop our policies in a way that looks at all the relevant dimensions of well-being. And for development, yeah, it's always a bit of a question, is the glass half empty or is it half full? I found it just difficult to comment on this, but I guess anybody here in this virtual room who works with the capability approach has as a task to just show what it can do then.
Okay, so it's a bit of a different question from the Q&A. There are quite a bit of questions that tie into this whole notion of collective responsibility or collective well-being perspectives. So Guberni M asked, could you explain more about getting collective well-being perspectives to build indicators? And Estudio Garifuna asked if how can we measure collective well-being in an indigenous people's context? And there are also other anonymous attendees who ask for the well-being of people who is responsible. Is it the individual or the state? Who has the agency actually? Or can it be a collective responsibility of these people?
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the questions. So collective well-being is an example, is, as far as I'm concerned, an example of a term where people in different contexts and different disciplines and different traditions disagree whether one should use this term and what it refers to. So I personally prefer not to use this term, but I think everything that those who use this term believe that matters, I also believe it matters. I just think we should use other words such as the common good, or yeah, I'm thinking about words in my own language and I don't know how we should translate it into English. But so it's about the quality of, you could even say the quality of society. But well-being, at least human well-being, because you have also the well-being of non-human animals, is something that, and here I really agree with what Martha Nussbaum has written on this, is something that is it's related to a body of a person. So the notion collective well-being from that perspective would be something like, could be two things. Either it would be the aggregate or hence the average well-being of a group, or it would be almost metaphorically in the same sense as we speak about the health of the economy. So some commentators and analysts speak about the health of the economy. Well, if you look at people who work in health studies, they would never use the word health to refer to the economy, because health refers to a living organism. You can't, a dead body also doesn't have any remaining health. So that's the first question. Is it used metaphorically, or is it used about the members of a group? And the reason why I prefer not to use the term is because I'm also interested, or I think we should care about the distribution of well-being within that group. And if you just talk about collective well-being, you may actually be not having the information that there are significant differences of well-being within that group. And then how that can be measured? Well, on my account, it would either be you develop a well-being indicator, and then you just map the distribution of that well-being indicator for the group, and you compare it with another group. That could be a way to do it. So, for example, if you have, say, in the USA, you have the well-being indicators of Black Americans and white Americans, and you see that life expectancy, which is one relevant functioning, is much lower for Black Americans. That is a relevant indicator of deprivation. However, if you're after the societal features, you need to have constructs that measure that. So I am not myself doing this kind of work, so I am not sure, but just speculating, I think that, say, measures of trust in a society or measures of that indicate the quality of, say, the rule of law, and those kind of features might be good indicators of the quality of a society. And then the question, who is responsible for well-being? Well, I mentioned in this modular account, I'm just taking it here, my notes. So there is, in the modular account, there is this C modules, and C4 is additional normative principles and concerns. Who is responsible for well-being, who is responsible for justice, who's responsible for any other value, is something that is an additional feature of a theory or of an account. So if you are what is called a libertarian, you think that everybody is responsible for their own well-being, and you can feel yourself, or you can take responsibility for the well-being of somebody else, but only if you voluntarily do so. The other spectrum, you are a communitarian, then everybody in the group is responsible for everybody else's well-being. And then there are all sorts of variations, and that's really what normative theories in the social sciences and the humanities are all about. So there is no one answer to this. And that means you can develop your own view, but as long as you can just defend it. Thanks for the questions.
So I have a follow-up on this, the points that you have discussed. Earlier, you mentioned when you were at Module A, you mentioned that for Sen, he finds that process freedom is a bit hard to fit into the notion of the capabilities. We see him writing this in his elements on human rights. He addresses some of these issues. But here, you also mentioned the whole notion of what it means to have measures of trust within society, and also the whole issue of distribution within society when we talk about a collective entity. So would you see process freedom fitting in, okay, perhaps not in Module A, but insofar as it necessitates a type of social interaction, be it some sort of consensus that has to be developed by people in their participation with each other, their interaction with each other, would you see this fit in Module B?
Raphael, this is your
This is my question.
Good, because then I can come back and ask you because I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure I got your question totally right, but my first answer is so the question is whether it fits in Module B or whether it fits in not at all. Is that the question? So
when you were introducing it in Module A, you did mention that Sen finds it problematic to put process into the capabilities approach. And here my question is, given that processes involves social interactions, certain types of normative behaviors and interactions that forms a collective or collective identity, if you like, a collective responsibility, previous question, and that since everyone is anyways involved in social relations and social interaction, they live in it, they're embedded in it, would you see process B then, process freedoms then as part of module B, where there is a mix between what is, well, so to speak, compulsory and what is optional? And the optional could be how the collective form their agreements with each other.
Yeah, so it depends on how you answer the question, what is the purpose of why you want to use the capability approach? So if the reason why you're using the capability approach is requires you to take a stance on the relevance of process freedoms, then you have to include it. And then hence it becomes part of it depends on the account you're developing, but I think probably well, it may figure in both human diversity, agency, and structural constraints, in the sense that that's really the fabric of social life.
Mm-hmm.
So, on the other hand, I also think this modular account, it's only meant to help us. So I would actually think it doesn't matter where you fit it in, as long as, so what the account, why I made this modular account is to enable everybody or to help everybody use the capability approach for whatever they wanted to use it where it can be used. So we should, again, also this modular account approach it flexibly without of course saying you can do anything you want, because then it becomes chaos or you no longer have theories and you, but I don't think it matters that much whether if there's something that for your question is important, fit it in. And of course a modular account is you could say it's almost like a heuristic device. It wants to help us in doing our research, doing our work. And there are surely places where some of these categories overlap, and then whatever you think is most helpful and where you can give a good reason for why you make a choice. That's why I stress you just need to keep on thinking. As long as you can explain why you do, just do whatever you think is best.
Thank you.
That's excellent. I think we might have a partial answer there to the next question that I have in mind. This one will be from Ollie Bowling, who writes that I think the question above about conversion factor is an important one. It seems like an element that has not been conceptualized fully. How do conversion factors, structural constraints, and sense heterogeneities all differ? And I believe the question above might have been from Thomas Bunshu, who has a slightly technical question about the relation between the different kinds of modules. So Thomas Bunshu writes, Ingrid, thank you for your illuminating talk. Please, could you expand a little on how you differentiate conversion factors, A3, and structural constraints, B5? For example, in your 2017 book, you discuss social norms in both sections.
Thanks. So now it's getting scary for me that people are asking me particular things I wrote in the book. No, I'm just joking. But I want to first ask Sebastian one very brief follow-up question on, you said, so the term structural constraints, conversion factors, and what was the third one? Human diversity, is that correct?
Sense heterogeneities, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, that should be it.
Okay. Yes, so I have seen applications of the capability approach where the people who are using it put a lot of, you could say, theoretical power in the conversion factors. The conversion factors were actually almost doing all the work in bringing in human diversity in the application that people were making. That is possible for some applications, because but not for all. What we need to remember is that these conversion factors, the definition is or the description, the degree to which the conversion of resources differs between people. So that means the conversion of resources into capabilities differs between people. So that means that there's always resources involved. And that is why people who like to bridge scholars who like to bridge the resources accounts, which can be all sorts of resources, and capability accounts, they really like to investigate this question of conversion factors. And that is, of course, one way to bring in human diversity, but not all capabilities are constrained by or are related to resources. You also have some capabilities that are constrained or that are enabled without resources being involved. So, for example, yeah, now I have to try to come up with a good example on the spot, but suppose something on which I know there is research being done. Suppose on the labor market, two people apply for the same job and they're similarly qualified, etc., etc. Then we know from research that women will receive lower financial compensation than men. So you see there that a certain conversion factor, namely the gender of the person, enables the same human capital, the same intellectual and personal resources, enables to or it's not just financial reward, but it's also saying being given mentoring or being given roles of responsibility and so on, or being given promotion. So you just see that being a woman on the labor market is there a limiting, you could say it's a conversion factor that is disadvantageous for women. But sometimes there are no resources involved. You could just say, so one of the things I found when I did my doctoral research 20 years ago was that when you look at violence, so violence from person to person, many of the violent attacks outside, so not in the home, but outside on the street, almost all the perpetrators are men. But actually, so this is something that I found then in the literature, and very few people seem to know this, but mostly they attack other men. So that is actually surprising, but that means that gender there plays a role in a way that in this case disadvantages men, but there is no resources involved. It just means that in this case, having the male gender disadvantages you in the public sphere, because if you are out and there are some alpha males who want to prove that they are on top of the monkey hill, they will just attack another man. So whether or not this empirical fact is still true, it doesn't matter for the discussion here, which is that sometimes there are certain structural constraints. In this case, it's, say, in this particular subgroup, the social norm that certain forms of masculinity require, or not require, but make this kind of aggressive men focus on other men rather than women outside in the public domain. There are no resources involved. So again, I think they both focus on different notions of diversity, how some problems are more prone to one group than another. And you just have to think about which one is most relevant for your purpose. So social norms indeed can play a role both in conversion factors as well as in structural constraints. Yeah, I'm running out of examples now, but I'm pretty sure if I would think for a couple of minutes, I would find examples where both in the conversion and but also in structural constraints, they play a role. I think the main thing to remember is conversion factors, as the term says it, conversion is from resources into functions and capabilities, and structural constraints can constrain the capability set directly. I hope this clarifies a little bit.
I think it definitely does. I think there's a relevant question that was asked early on that perhaps ties in well with your comments just now. And Charlotte asks, how can we use the capability approach to criticize misogyny in other cultures without infringing on their freedoms?
Okay. How can we criticize misogyny in other cultures without infringing on their freedoms? So I would like to know which freedoms, but yeah, this is a difficult question. So I should say I don't find the question entirely clear. Let me just give a few thoughts. One is, you can use the capability approach. What it brings is that it gives you especially an account of the things that matter in the quality of life. So if a certain set of social norms, and misogyny is a set of certain social norms and practices and so on, limits the quality of life of a certain group, in this case, in the case of misogyny, it's women and sometimes also transgender people, then you can just show which of those dimensions are constrained. If then the question is in other cultures, of course, it opens up the whole discussion about whether this is actually what we should be doing. Should we be criticizing people in other cultures, or should we be supporting internal critics? I mean, this really relates to whole discussions in, say, post-colonial theory and other discourses about who should speak about which problems, which doesn't mean that you can make the analysis, but the question is, what is the best thing you can do in your position? And I think scholars such as Serene Kader have written very good research about, in this case, first world feminism and the views they have about so-called third world women, and whether we are also not just projecting certain ideas on the situation. So I think this is an interesting question, but I think it's too complicated to just being able to answer in a conversation where I cannot ask any follow-up questions. So hopefully there will be an occasion at the next real the HDCA conference where we can talk about this.
That sounds excellent to me. I think on that note, we are approaching those 1.5 hours that we have allotted for this webinar. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our speaker, Ingrid Robeyns, for her very interesting presentation and thoughtful answers to the many questions that we have received. Of course, we haven't really been able to answer all of them, but we will definitely save the questions and relay them to Ingrid after this ends. Moreover, I'd like to thank the attendees, as in the audience, for all your comments in the chat, and of course, again, the questions. It's been excellent having you all here, and we hope to see you at the next webinar session. So thank you to Ingrid Robeyns, and thank you, the audience.
Thank you all. Bye.